On December 22nd of the year 1808, Beethoven gave a presentation of newly written works, most of them not even published. The audience got a very first taste of Symphonies No. 5 and 6, his fourth piano concerto, some parts of his Mass in C major, and the concert ended by his choral fantasia, especially written for this occasion. It was the biggest event the composer ever would organize, conduct, and perform. Temperatures in the hall were reported to be extremely cold, yet Beethoven kept his audience stuck in the unheated room for no less than 4 hours. It is also this concert that returns again and again as the most important argument against everything the whole beat metronome practice stands for, as one of the grand ladies of today's piano universe made it pretty clear recently.
By their logic, the historic concert would last 7 hours. Well, I take it back. A performance like that would not last through the first page of any of those scores. The audience used rotten eggs and other things like that instead of today's dislike button.
If that is actually the case, remains to be seen. It is hard for us to imagine today, but in those days in Vienna, even Beethoven had to fight for a place on stage. Possibilities were extremely limited. In summertime, the cultural elite fled the city, and for the rest of the year Vienna was prioritizing the use of its theaters in favor of opera. Only during the periods of Advent and Lent, when operas were forbidden, so a period of about 6 weeks, concert halls were available for composers to present newly written music in so-called academies. Beethoven finally was given access to the theater an der Wien for the 22nd of December. And in the royal box that evening, next to Prince Lobkowitz, we find Johann Friedrich Reichard, who we owe one of the descriptions of this concert from. In his book Reise nach Wien und den österreichischen Staaten, we read the following. This was a concert I couldn't skip, and so I accepted the kind offer of Prince Lobkowitz to take place with him in his personal box. There we withstood the bitterest cold from 6:30 till 10:30. If that statement is correct, and don't forget we do not have a second source to check Reichard on this, the following music was played in the time frame of about 4 hours. Part 1 contains Symphony No. 6, A Perfido, Opus 65, Gloria from the Mass in C major, Opus 86, and the 4th Piano Concerto. Part 2 contains Symphony No. 5, Sanctus from the same Mass, an improvisation, and the Choral Fantasia, Opus 80. If we want this concert to teach us anything at all about the correct reading of the historical metronome marks, we'll have to use those metronome marks to calculate the length of the different pieces, even in the awareness of the metronome being still 7 years from its introduction. The outcome of that exercise can be projected against the reported duration of 4 hours. So, which metronome marks do we have? For a majority of the pieces played that evening, we do have authentic metronome numbers. Beethoven, of course, marked all his symphonies, so also the 5th and the 6th. And we have Czerny for both the piano concerto and the choral fantasia. The 17-year-old Czerny, by the way, was part of the audience that evening. For the aria or the Mass, on the other hand, we have no metronome marks at all. Here, I used other works with similar notation we do have metronome marks for, and these 3 pieces anyways are the shortest of the entire program. So let me share the results with you. The first 2 columns give you the duration calculated according to the single beat theory, with and without repeats. The next 2 columns show you the result in WBMP. As it becomes clear now, based on the calculated length of the full program, both single and whole beat have a problem. Single beat is way too short, not less than 1.5 hours. Whole beat is too long, not by the same margins, but still 38 minutes at best if we take the most advantage calculation also for this option, that without repeats. Let's add 20 minutes to the entire calculated length, for we know that a small part of the choral fantasia was repeated because Beethoven forgot his own instructions to skip the repeats. Then there might have been a break, However, seeing the cold temperature in the hall and amount of music Beethoven wanted to perform that evening, that break probably wasn't very long. This more or less is confirmed, by the way, by our key witness, Reichard, who doesn't mention a break of any kind. Anyways, it doesn't make much difference in our outcome. The situation still remains pretty dramatic for both sides. Single beat at best is 29% off the 4-hour mark, meaning it lacks 70 minutes of music to come to the reported 4 hours. Whole beat is at best off by 24%, meaning it has exactly 60 minutes too much of music. I guess this is the first time for many to see the destructive consequences of these durations to the single beat side. On that part of the column, we lack no less than 70 minutes of music, meaning 2 entire symphonies of the scope of the 5th and the 6th together. Adding music to the program can hardly be an option. In other words, the data of the 1808 concert are entirely incompatible with the single beat theory, and for a mysterious reason, this obvious conclusion is too hard for the academic world to make. So, in a way, I guess we should be thankful to the famous pianist Valentina Lisitsa for commenting on my channel the way she did. I probably never would have dug this deep into this 1808 concert if it wasn't for her to trigger me. If anything, the 1808 concert was indeed a killer event for the SBT, the single beat theory. Keep that in mind and answer it every time you see this nonsensical 1808 argument surface anywhere. We're done with that part of the exercise already now. But what with the WBMP? Can we fix that side of the table? Well, the program of this concert is often quoted from Barry Cooper's book on Beethoven. But Cooper basically summarized what the 19th century Beethoven biographer Thayer had written about the concert. The Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung of 25 January 1809, however, publishes a copy of the printed program, and that turns out to be interesting. Apart from the fact that the 6th and 5th symphony were reversed in numbering, the Pastoral Symphony is given with all the parts. The C minor symphony, on the contrary, is only mentioned as Große Symphonie. Now, why could that be important? Reading this program with our today's eyes, we might not even wonder why for the 6th symphony all parts are mentioned and for the 5th not. Today, we are so used to performances of full sonatas, full symphonies and full concerti that we simply assume this was just the same in Beethoven's days. But that actually wasn't the case. Up to deep into the 19th century, works were given rarely complete. Am I saying this was certainly the case in the 1808 concert? No. The only thing I'm doing is trying to get the facts as straight as possible from within the context of 1808 instead of that of 2020. Just a little bit of background here on concert practices in the 19th century. In The Age of Beethoven, 1719-1830, New Oxford History of Music, Volume 8, page 223, we read the following. Often the second and third movements only were performed, a practice which persisted in the London Philharmonic concerts as late as the 1880s. In the same book, in the footnote of page 223, we read an historic quote from 1815. The same Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung as published the full program of 1808, saying the following only 7 years later. It is seldom that one hears a whole concerto or symphony instead of merely 1 or 2 movements. In Hamilton's 2008 book, After the Golden Age, we read on page 54, this was even the case for sonatas. When sonatas were eventually programmed at all, it was often only single movements that were given. Also in this book, we read that Liszt played 2 movements of Beethoven in Paris in 1836, connecting the variations of the A-flat major sonata opus 26 with the finale of the Moonlight. Imagine how reviewers today would write about that. Clara Schumann for years only played the last movement of the Appassionata only. then slowly deciding to add the variations to it, and finally, only in 1837 in Berlin, she took the risk to play for the first time the entire piece. Hamilton continues that even multi-movement works that, unlike most sonatas, had been composed with a generally public audience in mind, symphonies and concertos, for example, could well have had single movements performed separately. This view on the 19th century performance practice is not completed by a few quotes. I do realize that. There is much more material that illustrates this lost concert practice, but that's for later. Let's return now to the 1808 program by quoting Melanie Leeuwen in her 2007 book on the classical symphony, mentioning the diversity of the pieces in this same 1808 Beethoven concert. In the decades around 1800, the number and variety of pieces on this concert was not at all that unusual. Each half of a public concert program typically opened with a symphony, followed by an aria or two, a concerto, perhaps some chamber music and keyboard improvisations. Another symphony, or at the very least the finale of one, usually ended the concert. So seeing the Sixth Symphony announced with all movements and the fifth not very well could indicate just that. The Sixth Symphony played in full, the fifth not. With information like this, duration of concert lengths, it will always come down to a certain amount of speculation. But how does our key witness Reichard describe the fifth? Contrary to the Sixth Symphony, where he describes each movement as a different number in the program, the fifth only got one entry. 9-piece, a large, well-executed, too-long symphony. So was the fifth played in its entirety? The description is too vague to confirm one option or the other, but it certainly doesn't contradict the one-movement option either. One could say the words too long point to the entire symphony. Fair enough. And we'll take this option into account later as well, so no worries here. But if we stay close to Reichard another moment, the one-movement version might gain some more weight when we read about the sixth, that every number was a very long movement. So each movement described as long, similar to the entire fifth. And moreover, we read further that only the pastoral symphony lasted longer than a complete concert at the court would be allowed to last where I come from. Allow me to add a quick in-between here. Did you hear that? So the Sixth Symphony alone lasted longer than an entire concert at the court, probably in Berlin. That is interesting information we read here so unexpectedly. Wonder why we never heard about that in recent publications. Unless court concerts in Berlin were set at 30 minutes maximum, it again rules out the option for a single beat version at the 1808 concert. Good to know. But back to the fifth. When the fifth really would have been played completely, why would Reichard not describe the individual movements as he did with all other works played? He even mentions the slow movement of the fourth piano concerto, a piece of merely a few minutes. It doesn't make much sense reading a description of each and every movement of all pieces except from the second most important composition of the evening. We could speculate for days on this aspect, so let's stick to our two options, two possibilities to work with. In whole beat only, remember that. Single beat has fallen off the boat since even before we started this exercise. So firstly, we have a reconstruction with only the finale movement of the fifth, and secondly, we have a reconstruction of the concert with the entire fifth played. In option number one, we ask Beethoven to play only the finale movement of his Fifth Symphony. Why the finale? Well, Reichard speaks from a too long symphony. If it were to be one movement, it still needs to be a considerable piece of music. Some 4 decades later, by the way, the German Society in Worcester would serve a program also only with the C minor finale. Not saying there is any connection or tradition, it's just a piece of information showing the idea is not too absurd. Speculation? Yes, of course, and main reason important for you to remember, why sources related to lengths of concerts rarely, if ever, are being taken seriously to reconstruct the composer's intentional tempo. But hey, it's the 1808 concert, so let's continue. The entire concert, with only the finale movement of the fifth, same improvisation as before, same additional 20 minutes as before, would be about 25 minutes too long. In order to solve that, we look first at the choral fantasia. We reduce the length of the choral fantasia by 7 minutes, which is a reduction of 20% compared to the calculation of the entire Opus 80. We can do that because of two reasons. Firstly, it's a known fact that Beethoven rewrote the choral fantasia played at the concert heavily before it would be published as his Opus 80. It is also known that the improvisation at the beginning of the piece was not written out on the day of the concert. Read, for instance, Herbert Glass in his notes for a concert in which a New York Philharmonic played the Opus 80 in 2015. It should be kept in mind that both the choral fantasia and the G minor piano concerto as published were no doubt more polished scores than what was heard on that cold December evening. This explains the high opus number 80 of the Fantasy, which must be virtually have been rewritten after the quasi-improvised premiere. Beethoven was notorious for performing scores before they were completed. That leaves us with three possibilities. The length of the 1808 version was shorter, similar, or longer than the published Opus 80. All three options are totally legit, and so we take the option that works for the solution we're after. Beethoven made the piece longer afterwards, just 20%. That's all we need. Not particularly a strange thing for Beethoven to do, I'd say. But also Reichard informs us that this particular opening part of the choral fantasia was rather short. He literally says that bald das Orchester eintrat, meaning the orchestra joined the pianist soon. The later published Opus 80 starts with a written-out improvisation not fitting that description anymore. And with this pre-version of the Opus 80 at the concert that December evening, we only have 15 minutes to search a solution for. That already would be within a certain margin of error on the part of Reichard. But if you like me to fix also this, we don't have to do anything more than to increase the tempi overall by a minimal margin of 5%. 5% literally means Beethoven would have played the finale of the fifth in 88 instead of the later marked 84. Or you ask Beethoven to play the piano concerto's fast movement a bit faster even, since Reichard informs us that Beethoven played those in the fastest tempi imaginable. It was called Beethoven had just one evening for himself, a lot of music to show, so why not? After all, the concert wasn't there to create a benchmark for future tempo research, but to sell music. And also put Reichard's remark into the right context. He didn't have Valentina Lisitsa as a reference, but C.P.E. Bach, whom he knew in his younger years very well. So option number 1 is fixed. Now let's move to number 2, the full program. Adding 25 minutes of music obviously has some consequences, but let's not overthink this too much. Seeing the long program, let's think about his guests freezing to death and ask Beethoven to play just 15% faster than he would mark his works 9 years later with Melzer's metronome. That's all we have to ask to make everything fit. Outside the whole beat universe, you think? Not at all. Compare, for instance, with some tempi Karl Czerny gave for Beethoven's piano sonatas in no less than 4 editions. Just a few examples here. Prestissimo of Opus 10 number 1, tempi from 96 till 112. The Presto of Opus 10 number 3, from 126 till 152. Last movement of the Pathétique, from 96 till 112. First movement of the Appassionata, from 108 till 120. The differences between different set of metronomes will be rarely bigger than 20%. Compare, for instance, those tempi markings with, for instance, Moscheles or Von Bülow. But differences, of course, existed, not only between two different musicians, also in the mind and feeling of one musician, and so why not also related to Beethoven? Certainly, and remember that. See in the context of that evening, it was not a gala concert. It was a presentation, an exhibition of works. The compositions mattered more than the performance. And again, keep in mind, we're talking here about an event where Beethoven didn't even got the chance to rehearse the entire program with his musicians, where a large portion of the musicians was put together on the spot, musicians that never had played with each other, where Reichard describes the Mass and Aperfido to have been terrible in execution. We are comparing that situation with the calm of the study room 9 years later, allowing Beethoven to carefully mark the exact tempi for the symphonies. If you think a comparison between the 1808 concert and that moment where he gave his Metronome Marks is rather pointless, well, yes, I couldn't agree more. I'm only pushing this exercise to its limits since, as I told you before, it's been used so often as to disprove the WBMP, even reaching the ears of someone of the caliber of Valentina Lisitsa. Keep in mind also, guys, that 15% faster than whole beat still means 85% slower than single beat. In other words, if the single beaters want to recover this concert to their side, they'll have to ask Beethoven to play at least 85% slower compared to the single beat reading of his Metronome Marks. Not very likely, I would say. Not to mention that would defy any logic at all. And we are talking about the least likely option of the two. The icing on the cake would be Schindler's remark to Beethoven saying he took somewhat faster tempi in his younger years than later, and boom, everything fits with the entire Fifth Symphony in whole beat and in whole beat only. Yes, it's true, we are still 13 minutes over the threshold of 4 hours. I've seen that myself. But to fix that, we allow Reichard to write 10:30 when his pocket watch actually showed 10:07, and assume that the piano concerto indeed was played very fast. I know it sounds a bit silly, but it comes down to this almost ridiculous level of details and speculation when one takes durations of concert lengths as a foundation for tempo research. It's mixing two different elements that seem to belong from a distance, but in fact are not. So, two solid solutions in whole beat against not a single possible solution on the single beat side. So if the 1808 concert stands for anything at all, it is a clear rejection of the existence of the SBT, the single beat theory, at the minimum for music played at this concert, at the minimum for Beethoven's music. So do I care for this victory? If you consider the symbolic importance given to this concert, well then yes. The 1808 concert indeed has become one of those meaningless symbols served time after time as gatekeeper against the logic of the WBMP, and such symbols need to be taken down, which I just did. The 1808 concert now forever belongs to the WBMP universe, and one may hope this will be acknowledged as such by the Barry Coopers and Martin Nortens of today. But do I personally care about the 1808 victory? Let me reply by saying this. When Beethoven was asked about tempi later on in his life, he referred to his metronome numbers, not to the duration of this 1808 concert. Concert durations, at best, give some vague information on how a certain piece was played at a certain time by a given musician in a given context for a given audience in a given place. That's it. The only element that can teach us something reliable on the tempo the composer had in mind are his metronome marks. That's it, and that is important to remember. It's up to you what to do with this awareness. You can choose to be or become that 19th century performer and use your privilege to be your own master on stage. Give your very personal view on works of the past, make them your own, almost to a degree as if you are the composer. Perform them in the way you believe your audience expects you to play. That's how the majority of musicians performed music in the 19th century. Partly because they had to, but mostly because they believed this was the right thing to do. They called that progress of art, evolution. And we still are embedded more in this idea than we realize. Some say this channel is all about calling that attitude wrong and following metronome marks right. And those who say that feel bad about it, which I do understand. But it isn't the case. I will never even try to lift this fascinating tempo research to a kind of new moral standard. If anything, I would kill any moral standards in our musical world. It exactly are those standards that allow a portion of my colleagues to call me out for anything but friendly things. It is stupid, non-productive, and brings not exactly the best human parts to the surface. Something art, and especially music, should always do. So, imposing a certain new standard on anyone is the last thing I would want to do. You and I, we all are born with free minds, and you and I are responsible for our way of thinking and way of acting. Not anyone else, and certainly not me. So no, that's not what our work here is about. What we do here on this channel is try to go back to that initial moment of musical conception, the moment where everything in the composer's mind was ready. When he sat down to play his new composition, hear the results for the first time and real living vibrations of sound, and took his metronome to fix the tempo of that unique moment. We go back to that moment and that moment only, to learn from it, to try to feel that moment. That's it. Because in that moment, exactly when that damn metronome number was given by the composer of that music, that moment is the birth of the living composition. Right before the composer took the metronome, all came together for the very first time. And the unique part of all of that is that stupid metronome, that annoying ticking device, gives us the possibility to reconstruct that moment. Tick, 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 tick. Try it and listen and realize you hear a rhythm, a sequence that somehow perfectly matched the still echoing sounds of the very first performance. Listen to it, seriously, do it, and realize that you just have reconstructed something in the fourth dimension, that of time. Only the metronome can do that for us, and you are free to do whatever you want with it. But we believe it's pure magic. Magic that we feel so privileged to be able to share with you. So thank you, and thank you for being here with us.